This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hi guys, I'm here with the first video in my Brigitte work log series. So in this clip, or to get started, I'm working on the chest plate, and what I'm doing here is creating the pattern for it. So I started off by wrapping most of my torso in cellophane and then taping that down, like covering it in tape. And usually I would use duct tape for this, but all I had was this clear packaging tape and it worked, so I used it. Her chest piece is kind of like puffy and it doesn't form to her, so in order to create that shape, I also crumbled up a bunch of newspaper and then taped that into place so that it would, when I cut it out, it would be puffy and away from me. If you do want to skip all these steps, I have the patterns available on my Store Envy page. Once I had the pattern figured out and cut out, I traced that onto EVA foam and cut out those shapes. So the EVA foam I'm using is 6 millimeters. Basically for this entire build, all of the EVA foam I use, that is this gray color with the texture on the back, is 6 millimeter foam, and all of the colorful thinner foam is 2 millimeter foam. One of the first things I did was dremel the edges of the base pieces for the chest plate and then start gluing that together. So there was a center part and then a side of the front and then the back part. That all had to be glued together, and the center part is broken up into 3 pieces because I had to make sure it would curve correctly. The front part is broken up into 3 pieces so that I could make sure that it would curve correctly. The back part I just curve better later using a heat gun, and I do have a clip of that, so you'll see that in a little bit. Now I'm taking the pieces that create the yellow piece on the front of the chest plate and dremeling those. The front of these pieces are dremeled at a bevel, or so that they form a sort of, I don't want to say sharp edge because it's not sharp, but a beveled edge is probably the best way to explain it, and it's beveled so that the bevels face each other, if that makes any sense. If you look at a reference photo, you'll see what I'm talking about, or just photos of my costume, which are up on Instagram and Facebook and a gallery on my website. And here I'm taking contact cement and applying that to the bottom of the top part of the yellow piece and then the top of the bottom part of the yellow piece, letting that sit for the recommended amount of time and then sticking that together. To stick it together, I take my patterns and mark where the center is so that I can make sure I line it up, and I start by gluing it from the center and then attaching one edge and going back and attaching the other edge. I do this because I never cut out foam quite perfectly, so sometimes there's a bit of edges or a bit of foam at the edges left over. Here I'm working on the neck piece that sits at the front on top of that yellow piece, and I'm just creating these sharp bends by removing part of the foam from the back, gluing that together and bending it there so that it makes a sharp bend because now there's like a crease in it. And here I'm just touching up my dremeling job or beveling job on this piece because it was a bit messy at first. So I'm just cleaning this up using a small Dremel head. Now I'm taking a Dremel to Dremel down the sides at an angle to make it easier to glue onto the front of the chest piece and clean up the edges as well. Again, this helps kind of smooth out any excess foam that I had from my inability to cut out foam perfectly, even when I have it all patterned out. But before gluing on that yellow piece, I decided I would make the chest plate whole because I had not done that yet. I glued the front pieces together and the back piece was already one piece and curved that with a heat gun a little bit, but that was about as much as I had done. So here I'm dremeling the shoulder parts and then applying contact cement and sticking those together. And at first I was going to leave the sides open so that I could get in and out of it because I didn't think I could get it up over my head, but I found out later that I could. So while I have it just duct taped into place here, I do glue the sides together later. But if you would want Velcro or something so that you could open up the chest plate and make it a bit easier to get on and off, you could totally do that. This is what I'm talking about when I was talking about I take a heat gun to it and kind of just mold it with my hands to round this chest piece because her chest piece is sort of rounded. It's like a balloon around her almost. That's pretty much the best way I can explain it. But that's what the heat gun is for. It also helps relieve any tension from pieces pulling at each other due to like having like forcing a curve or whatever like the front part does or the shoulders do. In this clip, I've roughly traced out where I want the yellow piece to go by holding it up and then just taking a marker and tracing around it so that I knew where to apply my contact cement so I didn't have to apply a big layer or make it look messy or anything like that. So now I'm applying the contact cement all around those edges as well as around the edges of the yellow piece that I'll be attaching, and then I attach it following the guidelines that I had marked out there. Here is when I decided that I didn't need the sides to open and I could just glue them together. I mentioned earlier, this is where I'm doing it. This is a clip. That neck piece that sits at the front of her chest plate, I'm taking that and then just smoothing out the edges with a Dremel before gluing it into place. And for when I glue this piece into place, I just kind of eyeball it at what looks centered, although you can take a pattern and mark the center again like I did with the yellow pieces. Here I'm scoring this center detail and then hitting it with the heat gun to open that up, as well as curving those pieces slightly. Now I can start gluing everything on. So I'm gluing on that center neck piece first, and then I'll be taking those two side front neck pieces that we had just seen. They're almost like bolts, but not. I think I labeled them bolts in my pattern or something similar to that because that's what they reminded me of. I don't know what they're actually called. Anyways, once this is glued into place, I glued those on next because then that will give me a position. Again, when I'm gluing this, I wing it. You could use a pattern, but I think I got it pretty centered just by eyeballing it. So around her arms, she has a raised edge, and I decided to cut strips of 1.5 wide 2mm foam to create this edge. So the red foam is 2mm and it's 1.5 wide, and the length is going to depend on just however much you need. I just cut out a bunch of strips and then slowly glued that into place. It is a bit hard. They don't want to like curve around this nicely, so what I did was just let the foam gather in places where it needed to gather and then close that off, since both of those obviously had contact cement applied to them. It was easy just to close those off, glue those together, and then I take a pair of scissors, cut off the excess, and I dremel to smooth out that seam, and it wasn't noticeable in the final thing, at least as far as I could tell. It wasn't very noticeable. So originally I had removed this hole on the side of the base back pieces, the lower section, because when I was attaching those orbs, I was planning to put lights in them to have them light up. So if that's something you want to do, you can totally still do that. If it's not, you can totally not like cut out those holes. You could skip that entire step. It won't make a difference. Here I'm scoring between the triangle section and the rectangular section of the top part of the back that's like on the sides. It's that weird triangle attached to a rectangle piece, and again I'm just dremeling some more of the back pieces to get them ready to glue on. Here I'm gluing on the top layer to this triangular piece that's underneath the back piece. It sits like next to the spine pieces. Now I'm starting to attach more pieces. Here I'm attaching this rectangular strip for the neckline. It's not a perfect rectangular strip. It has like this weird lift that goes up so that you can glue another rectangle piece on top of that, as you can see the shape here. And I'm gluing that on with contact cement and then I'm attaching the rectangular piece that I just mentioned on top of that. Now I'm gluing the back of the base together, and I'm starting out by gluing the side base pieces onto this middle rectangular shape, and this makes up the bottom half of the base piece. Before moving on, I decide to dremel these side or edges at a bit of an angle to make gluing it into place easier later, and it was easier to dremel it before I glued on the rest of the base pieces. So now I'm working on gluing on the middle of the base section, and this piece acts more as a support piece than anything else. There is a little bit of it shows at the curve part, like this doorway looking thing that she has on the back. Again, if you look at a reference photo, you will know what I'm talking about, but it's not super important. Like, this isn't something you'd see really ever. It's just something I wanted to add because I felt it needed just a bit more support and some sort of, like, I don't know, middle section to have more stuff to glue on to the back, because without it, there was just a lot of hollow space inside this back piece. And here I'm gluing on the curved top half of the base of the back, and then taking a dremel and dremeling down all the edges, again sometimes at an angle if that's going to make gluing it on a bit easier, and then applying contact cement to both the back piece and the chest piece and gluing that into place. And I kind of just eyeball it so that I know, eyeball it to make it as center as possible. I don't mark anything out for this, and I think it turned out pretty center, but if you feel more comfortable marking stuff out, go ahead and do that first. And that's actually going to be it for this video. There should be 2 or 3 more parts, not quite sure yet, for the chest piece, so stick around to see those, as well as all of the other Brigitte videos in this series. I hope you guys found this helpful. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye.